I will start off by saying that I probably am one of those people who's born into being a Democrat and never really questioned it. My dad was the chief public defender in San Francisco. My godfather is Jerry. But, more importantly, I grew up, my mom is Chinese, so I grew up in San Francisco in the 80s and 90s and felt very directly what it was like to be a kid without the protection of 209, and had a very early conscience, I knew very early on, as did my friends, that it wasn't going to be fair, that getting into even Lowell High School before you get into UCs was going to be stacked against us because of the notion that there are too many of us, which is one of the most hurtful things I think you can say to somebody, because we all feel like we're all Americans, so how can there be too many of us, and how can that attitude be so pervasive? But I have to tell you that is something that people said when I was a kid very freely, and I hear quite a bit throughout this debate, unfortunately, in the year 2020. And another sort of side note, my aunt was actually part of the task force that looked at what was going on at UC Berkeley with the admissions of Asian Americans before the 1989 apology was issued. So a lot of what we hear right now is, don't worry about it. We're going to pass this thing. Quotas are illegal. We have Bakke. If history has taught us anything, it doesn't matter, because they find ways around that. So I think it's very clear that the goal is to keep Asian Americans out. I think they've made that very clear. I don't see how one can say that is not racist, because it is based on race. They're asking for race proportionality, which means they're removing merit, and they're also deciding some of us are lesser. That in and of itself, to me, is racism and not who we're supposed to be as Americans. And the last thing that really sort of worries me is that this is not an issue that is just within California. We're seeing similar policies crop up in New York City. We're seeing it at TJ High School in Virginia. And there seems to be a very prevalent attitude about keeping Asian American kids out of school and saying that we're privileged because we study a lot, and that there's an East Asian privilege, and that we're white adjacent, or, have proximity to whiteness. All of that is just a lot of different ways to label racism. And I think that we have, as a party, have to be really mindful about doing better and being better, because California hasn't always done right by Asian Americans. And to see us in the year 2020 moving so far back to where I was as a kid, and I'm now a mom and 43, it just upsets me, because I don't want any child to ever feel like they're not welcome at a school, because there are, quote unquote, too many of them. It's simply one of the most upsetting things to me. And then the last thing I'll just close with is, the danger of removing 209 is it's a very big and broad check that we're giving to the government. And I don't see it. It's so broad that it worries me. And when people say, don't be worried, well, I think everyone should be. They haven't really put forth any sort of narrowly tailored plan as to how they're going to help people, how they define a URM, how they're going to make sure this isn't a quota. Everything is just, trust us, this will solve everything. From, I'm surprised they haven't said COVID, quite frankly, but this will close the wage gap. This will, raise everybody up. But there's no plan in place, and there's no policy other than we want to be able to legally discriminate. And I just think that is absolutely unacceptable in the United States, but particularly in California, where we have a long, long history of treating Asian Americans quite poorly. So that's basically it for me.